Hello everyone and welcome to PC Retro Tech. So in this week's video I'm going to be continuing with this big box 486 build that I've been working on in the last video. So I have the front cover outside sunbathing, trying to brighten it up a little bit. It's covered in chemicals at the moment. And it's been a bit of a challenge. There hasn't been very much sunlight. Today is actually pretty good, so I'm hopeful that we'll get somewhere with it. But the main challenge has been the chemicals themselves. So here in Germany, they are very environmentally conscious, and so a lot of the cleaning chemicals that are available are just either anionic surfactants or cationic surfactants. So in other words, some random factory waste, which has been buffered up, and they basically put shampoo in it, and by the time they're done with it, it's about as useful as water for cleaning anything, really. So of course that's great for the environment, not so great if you want to brighten up retro computers. So I'm just having to persist with that at the moment. There is some chemicals in it that are useful for that, but they're really not very concentrated, unfortunately. So anyway, in the meantime I've been working on this CD-ROM rail system. You remember that there's a weird rail system in this, and none of the rails I had really fit. So what I did is I took some of the rails that I had available and just shortened them down, and at least I can slide the CD-ROM in now. I won't be using this particular CD-ROM because it's too recent, but at least I can now have it sitting in about the right position with respect to the front case. And it will fall out if I just let it slide forward, but of course if you're just using the PC, it's going to sit in the right position. So I'll have to get some correct rails at some point, and I guess it'll probably take years for those to come up online, but eventually I will replace those with the correct rails for this box. But at least we can finish the build and see how we go. So the other thing I noticed is that the power supply in this is August 94, and that seems to be just about perfect in my opinion for a DX4100 build. So I think this case is really the right era for the 486. So these are the four 486 cases that I have at the moment. There's this one here which is actually a big box 486, but unfortunately the feet are missing off the bottom of it and the cover itself is badly scratched. In addition to that, this cover here, I guess it was probably this black plastic, is actually missing. It goes over the turbo reset and key lock. And so unfortunately there's just really no way to make that into a very nice PC without basically buying a new case. This one here is almost a big box, and I bought it thinking that it actually was, but I didn't realize that there were these two different sizes, and when it actually turned up in the mail, I realized that it just doesn't have that imposing look that I'm after, and I'm pretty sure that the ratio of the sides is part of what gives it that really 486 look. There's also this compact case on the top, and it has some advantages. It is very small and light. In fact, the cover is actually made of quite a nice plastic, and so the whole thing feels good and is quite light, but unfortunately it's just not large enough to give that 486 vibe. So I'm certainly going to go with this one, which is the one that we've purchased, even though we have this problem with the rails. That will at least be inside and not visible to the outside, and there is some chance of getting the correct rails for it eventually. I'll show you another problem with this compact case as well. So when I got this, I wanted to put a 486 motherboard in it. That was quite different from the one that was in there. It had a really, really low spec 486 in it. And unfortunately the case had these bolts that were holding up the main board, so it's some kind of proprietary solution. I guess they were sort of like spacers, but not made of plastic but metal. And so if you put any ordinary 486 board in this, they would just short the bottom of the board. So I had to remove those, and unfortunately it took an enormous amount of force to get these bolts out. You can see the sort of hexagonal shape left by the head of the bolts. This is really thick metal, and it actually really surprised me just how difficult it was, even with, you know, a pair of pliers and all sorts of things that I tried, you know, rather large hammer and so on. And eventually this just damaged the bottom of the case. You can see there's some scarring there, and this is also twisted. Now I could drill this out and make some larger holes and say put some rubber grommets or something in there, or try and patch it up somehow, but in the end you're always still going to know that it's not actually original and that it has this problem. So you know, apart from the fact that it's too small for the kind of build that I want to do at the moment, it is also really damaged. So I think we've got the right case for the job here, and so long as I can brighten it up, I'm going to move the components from the semi-compact case over into the big box. And this has a DX4100 in it, and it basically has all of the right spec components in it. The only problem with it, of course, is just the size. So let's get to it and start moving the bits over from this one into this one. So this is the inside of the 486 that we're going to be taking the parts out of, and you can see that it has a Conner 1GB drive. It's a CFS 1081A, and this was manufactured in about 1996, and I think that's a relatively good match for the CPU that we're going to be using, which is an AMD DX4100. So with the AMD chips, there were two different variants available. The one that's in there currently is the A8486 DX4100 NV8T, but there is another option available that I have, and that is exactly the same part number with SV8B, and I believe that the T stands for write through cache and the B stands for write back cache, and it's my understanding that the write back cache is the faster of the two. In fact, I think with that particular chip we could expect up to 33% better performance than you would have with an equivalent Intel chip, although your marketing mileage may vary. So the other thing we have in here is a Senglabs ET6000 video card, and I thought hard about putting the original VGA card in that I talked about in the last video, but I think that just doesn't match this era as well, and the Senglabs ET6000 is really a fast card. So it is a Visa local bus card in this particular machine, and it really has very, very good performance. So I'm going to stick with that because I want a high-spec machine. The RAM is 32 megabytes of Edo RAM. It's a 72-pin chip, I believe that's what's in there anyway. And there's a 16-bit ISA Creative Labs sound card in here. It's a Sound Blaster, so I'm going to leave that in because I think that's also a good match for this era. So overall, the components that are here are pretty good, except for the CPU that I want to swap out if it will work. I also found a floppy drive which has a much brighter and whiter front bezel, so that'll match the case, hopefully, if the case ever gets bright enough. And it'll certainly match the CD-ROM that I want to use, which is also more or less from the correct era for this machine. Those are actually really rare, especially ones that work. So I do want to stick with the CD-ROM that's in this particular box. So the motherboard is an Opti motherboard. It's a V4P895P3/SMT version 4.0, which I think is another way of saying it's nothing special. It does support up to 512 kilobytes of cache, and as far as I can see, all of the chips that should be populated on this particular board are there, so I don't think that we have any problems with missing components in this. Although I have to admit I don't know very much about this board other than it works. In one of the other 486s I have, one of the Visa slots doesn't actually work, and so I prefer to go with a motherboard that I know is actually functioning. And besides that, I actually have Windows 95 set up for all of these components, so it makes sense to just keep using it. So I've managed to transfer all the components into the new case, and I had a few minor problems along the way. So This cable here, which goes to the power LED on the front, is actually missing the header that plugs into the main board. So that'll have to be repaired before I can use it. And I decided to go with just a CD-ROM rather than CD-ROM and 5¼ inch floppy. And the reason for that is because I don't think you really need a 5¼ inch floppy in a 486. I certainly have them in earlier machines, but it doesn't seem to match here. And indeed the colour of the drive was probably not even originally white. So even if I clean it, it's very yellow at the moment, I doubt that I can get it the same colour as the other parts here. I do have covers for the other slots, so it won't look like something is missing. And I think that's just a better solution all round. Now the CD-ROM is made in August 1995. It's a Gold Star CD-ROM, so that matches the era incredibly well. And the last I checked, this CD-ROM actually works, which is exceedingly rare. It's very hard to find CD-ROM drives under 12 times that actually work. And yeah, if you get one of those, they're really worth something. Assuming that people recognize that when they go to buy them. But yeah, you'll probably never see them come up online unless they're really, really expensive anyway. So the other major problem that I encountered, and this is certainly going to be more of an issue, is that the right back, the SV8B chip with the right back cache does not work in this motherboard. And I'm actually pretty confident of that at this point, so I found a motherboard manual for this precise motherboard and went through all the jumper settings to make sure they're set correctly for this CPU. And indeed there is a jumper for write through versus write back cache, but this is only for Intel CPUs. And in any case, the setting that you need for this CPU is actually what corresponds to write back cache in the Intel setting. Of course I tried it the other way just to see, but it simply doesn't post with this CPU in there. So it's definitely not a jumper setting. And I don't know whether there could be a fault somewhere. At first I thought that the CPU might be damaged. There were a lot of bent pins on the back which I had to straighten, and it looked like it had been dropped. But I think that the pins are just very, very malleable. So in the end I decided to try the CPU in another motherboard. And I spoke about this board previously. It's this one here, which has two VESA slots, one of which doesn't work, namely this one up against the edge of the board. Now I understand that you can have master and slave VESA slots, but it's also my understanding that the slave slot should still work. It might just be a bit slower for a video card. So I don't think that's the issue, but I also looked for jumper settings that might affect this, and there aren't any for this board as far as I can tell. The 16-bit ISA part works just fine. I can put a 16-bit ISA video card in here and that's no problems, but I've only ever once got this VESA to actually fire up a video card, and of course when the machine was rebooted it didn't work. So that was a Cirrus Logic video card. I've looked at the solder joints on the back. They all seem fine. The slot itself looks clean and everything is in order in there. And of course I've wobbled everything about and done all sorts of things to try and get it to go, and in fact it just doesn't work. So I'm not going to be able to have two working VESA slots in this, and that might seem like it's a problem because we have a VESA card for the hard and floppy drive controller and another one for the video card. But this board has the advantage that it has onboard floppy and hard drive controllers. And it's my understanding this might be better anyway. I don't know whether these just go through the VESA bus anyway. I really don't know the answer to that. If someone does know, let me know in the comments below. But I have heard that if you have more than one VESA card in a machine like this, they can actually interfere with one another in terms of performance because there's really limited bandwidth on the VESA bus. So that might depend on who you talk to, but that's what I've heard, so I'm going with it. But in order to really find out whether this board is going to be the fastest solution with the write back cache, I've decided to benchmark the two solutions. So I put the right back cache CPU in this one and the right through one in that one, and we'll see how they compare with otherwise identical hardware. And yeah, I think it's very likely this one's going to be the better board. It is more recent, it has PCI slots on there. Now, I wouldn't expect this to be a very good implementation of PCI. It's a VIA chipset, but an earlier one, I think. But it might be possible to get, say, a Voodoo 1 card for 3D graphics working on this, whereas that wouldn't be possible on this one, since I don't have anything other than PCI Voodoo cards. So that's another advantage that this machine would have, and I think being the more recent board, it has a better chance of being the faster one. But I think I want to check this first. I'm certainly not going to trade off, you know, a 5% improvement for a non-working slot. So that's the story. I'll try both out and benchmark them and see what the difference is, and then we'll make a decision about that going forward. So a few other problems I had. The video card in the machine at the moment, the Senglabs ET6000, has a minor fault. Sometimes when you boot the machine up, the cursor is corrupted. So it seems to use some kind of sprite technology for the cursor. There looks like about a, well, maybe a 64 by 64 square that it animates. So it's some kind of sprite technology, and that seems to be being corrupted just occasionally. It doesn't happen every time you boot the machine. So I'll have to put up with that for the time being. I do have another ET6000 in another machine that doesn't have this problem. But yeah, eventually I'm going to have to replace that with something else. I have a Cirrus Logic card that I could put in here, a 5428, which is also a very fast card and actually fairly comparable to the ET6000. So I could also switch over to that if it starts to annoy me too much. But that is something that I could eventually replace. Once again, you know, I'm pretty sure that collectors know that there are these faults with their bits and pieces, and that's why they move them on. You know, they very often don't describe all these faults in the description. But anyway, there is that minor issue. Another minor issue I had is that when ScanDisk runs on this, it says that it can't access the last cluster on this hard drive, and suggests that I swap over to LBA mode. I'm not actually sure that this drive works in LBA mode, and so I'm not clear whether I've set it up incorrectly or whether there is actually a fault in the drive. It doesn't seem to affect the operation. In fact, I'll start the machine up so you can see that it does actually boot. It boots very quickly. You can see that it really flies through the post there, and it did say that there was 256 kilobytes of cache, and it was running at 100 megahertz. And yeah, even Windows boots up relatively quickly on this machine. I have seen faster. I had a machine many years ago that used to boot up into Windows 95 in 5 seconds from a cold start. But this was a very special machine. I assume it had been modified in some way. And the manufacturer had made it so that it was a very, very fast boot machine. But anyway, the hard drive issue doesn't seem to affect normal operation of Windows, so for the time being, at least for benchmarking, I'm just going to leave it as it is. But at some point I might have to look into that and try and rectify that issue as well. And you can see the cursor actually is fine this boot, and it seems to be only about once every 4 or 5 boots that you see the corruption issue. So for benchmarking, I'm just using the benchmarking suite that Phil's Computer Lab put together. Thanks, Phil. And so there's a lot of stuff here. There's a 3D bench, there's Chris's 3D benchmark, PC Player benchmark. So those are all graphics ones. There are also some games, Doom and Quake. And then there are various others for system information. So I'm going to try and find one that'll do a hard drive speed comparison in the system ones, and I think I'll just run all of the other benchmarks and record them, because it'll be a pain in the neck to swap these motherboards back and forth, so I may as well get all the information that I possibly can. So Chris's 3D benchmark just rotates a little cube around. For some reason it needs 5 seconds to warm everything up, and then yeah, you can see that it just moves the cube around on the screen. And of course this is just a 2D card, so this is done using the CPU with 2D graphics as far as I'm aware, and it tells me that there's 41.4 frames per second, which is pretty reasonable in my opinion. And I'll show you the other two benchmarks in case you've not seen these before. Apologise to people who've run this thousands of times in their life, but you can see it's just again using 2D technology to do 3D rotation. And yeah, it runs through a few times and tells me that it's given me a score of 62.5, and I believe higher is better. And the PC Player benchmark, I'll run that in 64480 if it will work, and indeed it does not, so we're going to go with the ordinary PC Player benchmark, and yeah, that runs in 32200 here, and it's again just a 3D scene that moves about. So those are the benchmarks that I'll use, and again, as I said, I'll get a hard drive performance as well, and then we can compare these different solutions. So I found this little graph from SpeedSys quite useful. So this actually gives a graph of the speed of reading, writing and moving to main memory, and basically it does blocks of different size, so that if you've got very small blocks, you'll be in L1 cache, and a little bit larger will be in L2 cache, and then you have to read from main memory itself. And it's telling me that there's 62 megabytes a second from L1, 34 megabytes a second from L2, and 21 megabytes a second from main memory. So this should be a good way to compare the write-through and write-back caches. So this SpeedSys also does a hard drive performance test, and it's telling me that the average and max seek times are 10.88 and 15.36 milliseconds. Random seek is 10 milliseconds. Track-to-track seek is 3.45 milliseconds. Random access time is 19.54 milliseconds. It's not clear whether any of those should change because they should be based on the hard drive itself. But we have a buffered read speed of 2690 kilobytes per second rather, a linear verify speed of 3890 kilobytes per second, and a linear read speed of 1872 kilobytes per second. So all of those are values which we can compare with the other motherboard, which has the onboard hard drive controllers, and we'll see whether that makes any difference or not. So we already have an interesting result. This write-back cache CPU does not seem to be faster, at least not in this motherboard. So if I run the PC Player benchmark, which got 13.5 frames per second, or at least a score of 13.5 in the write-through cache CPU, it is actually much slower, and in fact all of the benchmarks are uniformly slower by up to 25%, which just seems too much, so I am beginning to think that there's some kind of misconfiguration here. So you can see it's only 11 here versus 13.5 with the write-through cache, and we would expect this one to be faster with the more modern motherboard and the better CPU. So something is definitely wrong here, and I noticed when I was fiddling with the memory that it's very fussy about RAM. So I'm going to try some different RAM chips and see whether that somehow affects it, but all of the other hardware is exactly the same. I do also notice that it misconfigures the CPU. It recognizes it as a Pentium S CPU, and there doesn't seem to be anything I can do about that with the jumper settings. So yeah, it really does look like this is actually the much slower option, and we'll probably have to go with the original motherboard that I had in there, which was with the write-through cache CPU. So I have actually found some options in the BIOS which I can change, which affect the memory and cache, and the performance is now back up to just over what it was with the other motherboard, although there's nothing really remarkable about the difference. So the options that I needed to select were to combine alter and tag bits, and I assume this has something to do with the way memory locations are marked by the cache, but I don't know the details. But that made the biggest difference. It jumped from a score of 11 here to 12.5. Then there's an option for decoupled refresh. I guess that refers to DRAM refresh, and that brought it up to 13. And then there was a cache timing option, which I already had selected fast, but I hadn't realized there was actually a turbo option, and so switching that on takes us up to 13.7. And so that seems to be the best I can do with this particular motherboard, and so it's obviously not anything to talk about, anything to write home about. It's really only just a very, very tiny bit faster than the other motherboard. Unfortunately, the hard drive is a different story altogether. Even with block mode enabled, the buffered read speeds go up a little bit, but the linear read actually goes down, and in fact it's nearly half the speed of the other motherboard for I/O, and this is where you'd really like to have a second VESA local bus slot available, because I could go back to the original controller that I had, which is presumably much faster than the onboard one here. Just disable the onboard one and put the card back in, but of course I only have one working VESA slot in this board. So this board is just going to be a no-go, it seems. It's a bit disappointing. I had expected this to be substantially faster than the other machine, but it's really not. So I've got the motherboard and all the parts back in the case now, and as you can see, the cover is back inside from sunbathing for days upon days in chemicals, and it doesn't look too bad. It's still a little bit off-white, but the light inside here is not very bright anyway, so it sort of shows up more than it would otherwise. You can just about see where that sticker was still on the side here, so there is still a slight difference between the two tones there. But it's really bearable now, and I think the whole thing has come out looking quite good. I have actually tried to run it all, and everything seems to be working, although I notice a lot of newer games require a VESA BIOS, like Need for Speed and Screamer 2 and so on, and they won't actually install. So there are utilities you can get to provide that, but unfortunately they don't recognize the I think the graphics card in this machine, and so I've been unable so far to get those to run. But it doesn't matter too much. This is mostly for DOS games and for Windows 95. That's what I intend to use this for, and so that doesn't really affect any of those things. I have much later and much better computers to run those other games that don't run on here. So another thing I discovered when I put the front cover on, this label or badge had actually come off in the chemical soup that it was soaking in all week. And initially I thought this grey bit above the writing was some splotchy glue, and that it had been glued badly. But it turns out that that is actually a logo. So I don't know that they designed it very well. There's a reflective silver backing on it, and I guess the idea was that it was supposed to reflect through the badge, but unfortunately it just looks like this kind of faded grey, I guess it's an aeroplane. I'm not sure. I think it's an aeroplane. So yeah, it doesn't look real great actually, and it might be worth getting a different badge at some point in the future and putting it on here. But otherwise I'm very happy with this. I need to get a 17-inch monitor, of course, and I actually have ordered one of those. Getting one from this era that's not really dirty is going to be almost impossible, of course. Those monitors really spray out stuff when they're running, and they sort of have almost like burn marks on them from this era. So I don't think I'm going to be able to find anything really nice for this, but some of the later 17-inch monitors will go quite nicely with this. So anyway, that's all for that, and I guess now we have to think about what we can run on this machine. So I've installed Screamer. It's just a demo actually of the game, and you can see that there's no sound. In fact, I've had a bit of trouble getting the Sound Blaster to work from DOS, This is of course pretty standard for the era. It does work in Windows, no problems at all, but even with the DOS utility, run diagnose, etc., it just doesn't work. In fact, there seems to be something wrong with the Screamer auto detect. So anyway, at least we can admire the fancy graphics from the 1990s. It's pretty basic, as you can see. Of course, it's just 2D cards, so you can't expect too much from this at all. I did try and get the 3D card, the Voodoo card, working in the other machine, and had absolutely no luck whatsoever. So I really don't think it's supported very well by that PCI slot. So in the end, there were just too many problems. In fact, even the mouse didn't work. The serial mouse port on that motherboard wasn't working at all, and so I had to connect up a PS2 mouse, but unfortunately I don't have the correct header for that. So this is definitely the best option out of the two boards, and as you can see, it runs quite smoothly for 320 by 200 games. So I'm not going to run any other games on here today. I'm going to finish there because this video has already been quite long. I wasn't expecting to have quite so many issues along the way. So that's it for today. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you in a later video. Bye.